Welcome to part 2 of all the off-grid power sources. In the previous video, we discussed all the active sources that could be utilized in an off-grid system. Now we will focus on the passive sources. Passive sources produce power without your input. In other words, they will produce power whether you like it or not. They will also produce however much power they want, whether you like it or not. Keep this in mind when designing your system. Having an overbuilt passive system can produce, or will have the capacity to produce, excess power that you can't harness or benefit from. So let's get into it. So first of all, we have photovoltaic, solar panels. A low maintenance power source with no moving parts. Simple, predictable, reliable, easy to install, and easy to expand. That's why solar is the go-to off-grid source. That being said, let's get into the realities associated with solar. Solar has a fundamental quirk that is both a blessing and a curse. That is solar's cyclical power output, both daily and yearly. You're going to be working with that half sine wave all the time. This is a fact of life for solar for every daily cycle. Try to take advantage of that midday sun for large loads. However, usually solar produces the most power when you're not home. To have a 100% solar setup is committing to life with a duck curve. Try to put in place systems to take advantage of any overflow because you are going to have that peak output during the middle of the day. And for the yearly cycle, seasonal variations will lead to issues. Even with sun trackers, your solar array will always produce less power in winter. This problem is more pronounced as you approach the poles. So for those of us living at high latitude, just be aware of this. Now let's get into the different mounting systems. For mounting systems, we have a couple of options available for us. The simplest of all is the ground mount. This is a system that is at a fixed angle and is typically the cheapest to install. Next, you have a roof mount. Now, if your roof is at the right pitch and orientation for your location, that's fantastic. However, it is typically more expensive than a ground mount, and there are insurance and access complications. A pole mount with 3 different settings, that being for the summer, equinox, that being spring and fall, as well as the winter, is probably the best compromise for performance and cost out of all of the systems available. Then we have tracking, whether it be a single axis tracker or a 2-axis tracker. For off-grid systems, these might be more trouble than they're worth. Generally not pursued for a homestead, but if you are trying to do something more portable or mobile like a van life setup, then maybe having some kind of active tracking is applicable. With all mounting systems, keep in mind that access is important. Maintenance is critical, whether that be cleaning off snow, in which case you want to get the snow off early. Be careful not to scrape up your panel with tools. You don't have to get it all off, you can get it down to a thin layer and then it should melt off fast. Also, we have panel washing for dust, pollen, and even bird poop. And lastly, we do have general inspections for panel health, checking out on things such as hailstone impacts or any other damage that could occur to the panels. It's good to keep an eye on your solar panels and not have them in a place that's inaccessible. Something else I want to say about solar is that if you are going to have it installed by somebody else, don't be bamboozled by installers. Their job is to sell you panels. Their job is to sell you more panels than you need. They may want you to buy way more capacity than you'll ever use, usually for around $2 a watt or more installation cost. You can do it yourself for half that or less. Also, most homesteaders would generally only need 3 to 8 kilowatts of installed solar for an all-electric house. Most installers are going to push you for a 10 kilowatt or more system. Just do it yourself. The other thing about solar is that it is tempting to overinvest in solar. In that case, you are putting all your eggs in one basket, and that's great for when the sun's out, but you are limiting yourself if there's any weather or seasonal issues whatsoever. One cloudy or stormy week and your entire massive solar array is useless. Diversify your collection. I do understand if solar is your only option, if you live in a place where hydro and wind are not applicable, but still, try to diversify your setup. So when it comes to used panels, secondhand panels, panels you buy online from Facebook Marketplace or eBay or Craigslist, here's what's important. It's not actually the panel's efficiency. That's not the most important thing we want to look at. What we really want to look at is the panel type, whether it's monocrystalline or polycrystalline. This helps relate to the output voltage of the panel. We also want to look at the panel wattage. You tend to want to pair panels in sets of like model and output voltage. Also look for the price point. If you can find something for 85 cents per watt or less, that's a pretty good deal as of 2023. But here's the most critical part when you're looking at used panels. Try to find the age of the panel. Usually on the back you'll see the date it was manufactured, and just try to keep your panels as young as possible. You're looking for somebody who bought a lot of these and never really did much with them and they're only a few years old. The other thing about used panels is that let's go into the end of life plan for solar panels. Well, here I'd say just expand your array or build another array. Usually even old panels, unless they are literally broken in half, will produce something. So if you're okay building another array, like a secondary array, and putting another separate charge controller on there, then you should be able to get some life out of these panels till the day they literally fall apart. Lastly, we're going to talk about controllers. Now the thing about controllers is that there's many different types. You've got the simple PWMs, you've got the more advanced MPPTs. I would say the most important thing with controllers is not necessarily the type of controller they are, it's just having a controller that has some kind of logging and monitoring. That way you can actually see what your records say. I personally like Victron and Midnight Classic controllers. Use whatever controller you want. I just would say try to find something that logs. I might do a video on controller settings for best yield and battery protection. I will tell you it's very hard to get both those things. Usually you have to pick one over the other. I tend to go for battery protection and battery long life over yield, but that's just me. The other thing I'm going to say about controllers is that if you have two separate arrays at two different angles, or two arrays that have two different type of panel architectures or associated with them, then you should probably just use two different controllers. That way they don't fight each other and the controller isn't having to compromise between both of the arrays. That's all I have to say about solar. Let's get into wind. So wind. Wind is a great companion for solar. It's nice to have something that can produce power at night, but here's my reason for using wind. The thing about a wind turbine is that it is possible for a wind turbine to produce its maximum power output at any time of day, any time of year. Not necessarily that it will, but it is possible. This is something that a wind turbine can do that a solar array fundamentally can't. However, my other disclaimer about wind is that if there is enough wind to justify a turbine, you probably don't want to live there. This is kind of a rule of thumb for wind turbines, but if you can get a tower tall enough, you might be able to avoid this issue. So the thing about turbines is that they have this interesting habit of producing power when it's needed, whether that be in the evening, at night, during cold or stormy weather, even during a blizzard. The most powerful and most valuable power is the kind that is produced when it is needed, not necessarily a system that produces the most power in a 24-hour or yearly time frame. That being said, in a 24-hour time period, you can typically expect a 2 kilowatt solar array to produce around 8 to 10 kilowatt hours. A 2 kilowatt wind turbine should produce at least 2 kilowatt hours on average. It could produce more. Theoretically, it could produce 48 kilowatt hours. Not necessarily that it will, but there is that limitation to take into account. Keep in mind that when you estimate yields for solar or wind, we are assuming that 1, the battery has adequate space to absorb this power, and that 2, the system has a load that is consuming this power, because as that battery fills up, your yields will reduce. So don't be too hard on a wind turbine if you never see it produce as much as you think it will, because there's no space for that power. Now, here is the downside of wind turbines compared to solar. Wind turbines are much more rambunctious than solar. They need to have their power dealt with to avoid over-revving. Turbines produce power through induction. Electrical current cannot be stopped instantly. In a sense, inductive power sources produce momentum. Literally, you can see this in the flywheel action of the blade spinning. So we need to have countermeasures to take into account the overvolting from the over-revving. These can be mechanical brakes, they could be electrical or electromagnetic brakes, they could even be dynamic feathering. There are both simple and complex control systems, but this needs to be sorted before you can leave a turbine alone. In high wind, a turbine can easily double its rated power output, so do take this into account when you install your countermeasures. Thermal solar. Congratulations, because you use it. In fact, everyone already uses it in some capacity. But here let's define the subcategories so you know what I mean. So first of all, we have passive solar design, otherwise known as south-facing windows. Now the thing about passive solar, and you'll notice this as a trend, it doesn't really produce electricity, but it is reducing the amount of power you would otherwise need for heating in winter, and maybe even reduce the amount of power you need for water heating in summer, which leads us to solar water heating. This will definitely be reducing your electrical demand in summer, which might not always be necessary, but it is still nice if you're designing your system from the ground up. With the proper setup, it could also reduce your water heating demand in winter. This gets really interesting if you start to store heat in water for a hydronic system. That way you can have on-demand heat in the house, but that's really pushing solar water heating to its limit. For electricity production, it's a bit more complicated. Yes, you could use concentrated thermal solar to run a steam engine, a Stirling engine, maybe even a thermoelectric setup. This could be done, but usually these systems would not be financially competitive with PV, which is a solid-state, straight-to-electricity solar collection method. So in conclusion, the strength of thermal solar lies in reducing the electrical demand required for heating, whether you're heating water or just heating your house. It is not necessarily in producing power itself. So now we arrive at hydro. Here I'm going to cover both the active and passive hydro setups. Hydro in general is kind of like the holy grail for off-grid power. It can produce power 24 hours a day and might even produce it 365 days a year. Of course, there will be seasonal variations and even weather variations which could affect this, but in general, I would love to have a hydro setup even with these limitations. That being said, hydro situations are pretty rare and most of us won't have access to a creek or stream that could support one. Even if I could get a few hundred watts, I'd love to have a hydro situation, but I just don't have it on my land. So first let's cover passive hydro. Passive hydro has similar issues for wind with regards to over-revving the system. However, controlling a passive hydro system is a lot easier and cheaper than wind. Having a simple spillway to make sure your turbine is never overloaded is a pretty simple solution, as well as the control systems can be much simpler than they are in wind. Things get a bit more complicated when we consider active hydro. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not referring to active hydro as pumped hydro storage. We are not going into that domain. I think it's a great idea. I might cover it in the future, but that's not what I mean when I say active hydro. I'm referring to throttled hydro. The idea here is to have an active control system that only releases as much water as necessary to support the system. Having an actuated sluice gate or valve would achieve this. This can help a hydro system during low flow portions of the year, or it could make a traditionally non-viable creek or stream available for a hydro setup. A setup like this paired with an intermittent power source, like a wind turbine or a solar array, could store the water when system demand is met by that wind or solar, and then release the water when it's not. This is still not technically pumped hydro storage, it's more efficient hydro utilization. So there we have it. Those are all of the passive power sources. Now we've covered all of the active and passive power sources for off-grid. In the future, I'd like to do more detailed breakdowns of all of these systems and try to incorporate as many of them as I can on my own property. So I hope you enjoyed all this. I hope you learned something. And again, please leave a suggestion in the box below. See ya.